Hello everyone, my name is Aakanksh Gurnani, and welcome to my YouTube channel Neuro Chat with AG. On this channel, I plan to cover topics that are closest to my heart and support the neurodiverse community. Topics related to neurodiversity, autism spectrum disorder, and more. On the channel, I will interview thought leaders, esteemed researchers, scientists, professors, doctors, and psychologists, seeking their views and updates on their latest work, research, etc. I will also chat with parents of neurodiverse kids and adults and talk about experiences of neurodiverse individuals. Dr. Dave Caudel is the Executive Director of the Frist Center for Autism and Innovation at Vanderbilt University. His work is dedicated to advancing the integration and support of neurodiverse individuals in the workplace. Being diagnosed with autism in adulthood, Dr. Caudel brings a unique perspective to understand challenges faced by autistic individuals in their personal and professional lives. The Frist Center aims to engineer technologies and transform workplaces to be more inclusive. The approach is designed to understand and promote the abilities of neurodiverse individuals. It is a team of engineers, scientists, scholars, practitioners, and business people who are either living with a neurodiverse condition or are touched by loved ones on the autism spectrum. Dr. Caudel, welcome and thank you very much for the time today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Could you please talk about your journey and how you became involved with autism advocacy in the Frist Center?
It all started with, I've been autistic my whole life, but for much of my early life, I had no idea that my weirdness had a name and that other people have the same sorts of challenges and struggles I have. I just knew I struggled with things that other people don't seem to struggle with, and some things seemed easy to me that didn't seem easy for a lot of people. But I took a very non-traditional route into the workplace. I worked a variety of jobs, including as a U.S. Army soldier for the first 7 years of my adulthood. And it wasn't until my 30s I decided to give this a college thing a try to see what that was all about. Fell in love with physics, started working my way towards a PhD in physics, but while I was still an undergrad, that's when I first learned that I might be autistic. And when I first learned that, I was offended. And I went to research it. And as I researched it, I realized I had a lot of misconceptions about autism and that I could actually be on the spectrum. But once I got that diagnosis, once I understood that, the first thought I had about the idea that 2 to 3% of the population may actually be very similar to me is it broke my heart. Nobody should have to go through what I went through just to try to be successful in life and try to get along in a workplace. And no matter what flavor of neurodivergence you are, we're all united in one thing. We live in a world that's not optimized for us. It was optimized for the masses. And one of the consequences of being wired differently is sometimes what works well for everybody else doesn't work well for us. And so, my first reaction is I was a little upset and saddened that an entire fraction of our population kind of goes through what I went through. I was also kind of surprised that there was so many of us, and how come I didn't know that? How come I didn't realize it? I've since kind of come to understand that we learn to mask, to kind of walk and talk and act in a more normal way, so the normals can kind of tolerate us and allow us around and include us and make us a part of things. If we act too weird from everybody else, we tend to get isolated and excluded. Most neurodivergent people learn this at a fairly early age. And so we learn to mask a little bit. And I understood that our mask may not be very effective for other people, but our mask is really good against each other. And so I almost certainly was interacting with autistic and neurodivergent people throughout my life. I just didn't so easily recognize that I had something in common with them that I don't normally have in common with most people. But all of that sense, and there was also like a building anger and frustration that I was like 35 before I realized that I was autistic, and that information was there the whole time. But there's a ton of misconceptions and misunderstandings in society and culture and stuff. What I thought was autism and what autism actually was very, very different from each other. And part of it is because I learned about autism from like watching Hollywood and TV shows and stuff like that, which I'll be the first to admit that's not a good place to go to get information on how the world works. But this is the reality we kind of live in. Sometimes what we learn about a subject is nothing more than what we've seen in film or on TV. But I was very highly motivated in that moment to say, I'm always the type of person that is like, if I see something that needs to be changed and I'm frustrated that things are the way they are, well, is there anything I can do? Is there anything I can have an impact? And I realized that was something I could potentially have an impact on. So I immediately became an advocate, not just for myself and my own accommodations to be able to thrive and be successful, but also for the wider autistic community. And as years went on and I started learning more about other forms of neurodivergence, I sort of expanded my advocacy to that. So from that day to this, I've been a very passionate advocate for autism, neurodivergence, any sort of difference that is not being very well accommodated in most workplaces and most cultures today. And I think it was that self-advocacy work combined with my PhD in physics. The combination of those two things are what attracted the people who were first thinking up the idea of the Frist Center. And they wanted somebody who ran the day-to-day operations who both understood the scientific process, which anybody with a STEM PhD has a good handle on the scientific process. At its core, it's the same process, whether it's biology, chemistry, or physics. It looks different as you get into the weeds of those specific subdisciplines, but it's all built on the same foundation, the scientific foundation. So they wanted someone with a good grasp of the scientific foundation, and they wanted somebody who was knowledgeable and passionate about autism and neurodivergence rights. And I think they also were kind of intentional about getting a self-advocate, someone with lived experience, someone who was actually autistic to be a part of that. And I just happened to check all those boxes. So part of it was about the right place at the right time. I wasn't thinking to get into this field. I was planning on being an experimental physicist the rest of my life, and I would have been perfectly happy at that job. And then as a passion, on my off hours and stuff, I would continue to advocate however and wherever I could. I'm extremely blessed and fortunate that I get to satisfy my science itch and my self-advocate itch all at the same job. I'm a very fortunate individual for that.
How has your own diagnosis of autism in adulthood influenced your work and perspective on neurodiversity in the workplace?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about those of us who are autistic, and there are other forms of neurodivergence that have along a similar vein, is our tendency to hyperfocus, our tendency to find specific hobbies or interests or passions that we really like hyperfocus on and fixate on. And we really love learning everything about that thing and getting into the weeds about all the minutiae and the details. That's a place where our detail-oriented minds really flourish. And so, being diagnosed autistic, when I was first studying that, there were so many unanswered questions from my life, so many mysteries I'd never been able to figure out myself, that with the diagnosis suddenly came in a whole new light. And suddenly I had a much deeper understanding of myself, a much deeper understanding of the people around me, a much deeper understanding of the wider humanity, is extraordinarily useful. The more I learned, the better context I had, answering a bunch of unanswered questions that I've been struggling with my whole life. And then, of course, immediately, I noticed all the things that science doesn't yet have an answer for. Autism itself, for all that it's been studied and for all we understand about it, there's still a lot that we don't yet know. There's still a lot more research that needs to be done. And if I'm upset that there's not enough research that needs to be done, well, I could sit around and whine about it, or I could, try to participate in whatever way I can to redress that issue. And so my diagnosis, I was almost like doing autism research as a passionate amateur before I actually got into this work. And I understood what a game changer it was for me. And I also think about what a game changer can be for other people out there who have neurodivergence and may not know what flavor of human being they are, what label. So in that regard, it's absolutely influenced my work. It's kind of hard to separate my passions from my job, because in this case, my passions and my job are kind of like the same thing. It's basically, my work is just basically, I just get paid very well to do what I would want to do anyway, what I love doing anyway. And if anybody can ever find a job like that, I highly recommend it.
Could you please talk about the Frist Center's mission and its aim to transform workplaces for neurodiverse individuals?
Yeah, at its core, autism in particular, and our name is Frist Center for Autism and Innovation, but we're really thinking about all forms of neurodivergence, not just autism. But if we take autism, autism is the most extreme example of this out of all of them. Over 80% of autistic adults are unemployed or underemployed, including people with college degrees, including autistic adults with college degrees. That's higher than any form of disability or difference in this country. So it's a huge unmet need. We know is for all that we don't know with research, we do know a lot of those unemployed, underemployed people would be brilliant and successful in the workplace, real meaningful contributors to society if they had the right accommodations and supports. Those are the two things that we know. The question is, what are those accommodations and supports? What do they need to find and then thrive in meaningful employment? And we specifically take the approach of a strengths-based perspective. All human beings have strengths and weaknesses. That's just what it is to be human. But if you're autistic, you have a particular set of strengths and a particular set of weaknesses that vary from individual to individual. But there are, just like it's much harder for me to read nonverbal cues and be able to understand the neuromajority when they're talking, because they use language in a very different way than those of us in the autism spectrum do, which is a very literal sort of way. You know, there are lots of things that I struggle with that most people do not struggle with. Most people, is so easy for them that they can't even conceive of how anybody could struggle with it. And so when they see us struggling, they make assumptions that, oh, we're just lazy, or maybe we're narcissistic, that you're not right. It's almost like we live in a world of blind people, and they don't notice that we're in a wheelchair and we're kind of like incapable of getting up and standing, and then they're yelling at us because we're not standing up and grabbing something off the top shelf. Our disability is invisible to most people because people tend to look at the things that we're good at, look at the things that we're capable of, and then they just extrapolate and assume we're equally as good as them at everything else. That's some of the struggles that we kind of go through. But, you know, on the flip side, there are things that are really easy for me, things that are so easy for me that just like everybody else struggles wrapping their head around, gosh, how could you struggle with that? I have the same sort of thing when it comes to like pattern recognition. My attention to detail and my hyperfocus makes it really easy for me to do a deep dive and learn a lot about a subject in a relatively short amount of time. And before I recognize that other people do not have hyperfocus like that, now it makes sense to me why it seems from my perspective that people struggle to be able to dig as deep as I can about things. So there are things I can't do as well as everybody else, but there are things I can do better than most people. And ideally, you want me in a job where I'm good at something, right? I mean, we want that for all jobs, whatever job it is. If it's flipping a burger at Burger King, you know, we ideally want somebody back there who enjoys the job, who's good at the job, who takes pride in their work. You know, we're going to get a better burger out of that. Like, we want that person in that job. So all of our jobs, it's about getting the right mind and putting it in the right job. And we know that there's this high unemployment, underemployment rate. We know with the right accommodations and supports that these folks would be brilliant, successful contributors. And that's not just a guess that we're making. There are a number of companies, a growing number of companies in the world who have recognized the value of autistic talent, have recognized with specific jobs that they have that an autistic mind is perfect for this sort of job and would really thrive and be successful. And so they've gone to great lengths to figure out what accommodations and supports these folks need. And that's one of the things that we kind of help people with. But those companies, we don't need to sell them anything. They understand that there's a lot of cognitive potential there. I mean, anybody can look at Silicon Valley and look at all the billionaires and millionaires who are on the autism spectrum. You know, even someone who struggles like putting two and two together could kind of recognize, well, maybe there's something to autism that has allowed these people to make these sorts of discoveries and stuff that it ended up like generating a lot of wealth as a result. Not every autistic person is like that, but it certainly shows that there might be more there, that maybe we should be judged more on our strengths than our weaknesses. And if one of our strengths happen to land into a critical job task that you have, that you need somebody to do a good job with, and you see that we would be perfect for that job, or some of us would be perfect for that job, and if we got in there with the right accommodations and supports, we would crush it and just do a phenomenal job, like day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. I mean, companies, whether they realize it or not, are desperate for employees like me. They're absolutely desperate for employees like me, but they're going to have to put in some work. They're going to have to make some effort to make a workplace that's more accommodating for me. So that's that. I've overly simplified it, but that's the crux of we're trying to help the workplaces be more accommodating and inclusive for neurodivergent individuals. And we're also trying to work with those neurodivergent individuals to teach them some of the soft skills and professional developments that, from my perspective, normal people have this amazing superpower to go into a new environment with no briefing, no information, and within a matter of weeks, just yada yada their way into an understanding. And now they're a part of the culture and they're speaking the lingo and they're in sync with everybody else. That is amazing to me. That is a superpower that people don't seem to understand that they possess. We can learn all those things that they learned, but we need a little bit of hand-holding. We need a little bit of explicit instruction, the do's and don'ts and the lays out. I think it's one of the reasons why some of us do better in a more structured environment. So professional environment is a more structured environment. Autistic adults are certainly capable of learning professional development and becoming highly professional and capable people. It's just the existing systems that we have in place. It's just expected that people are just going to yada yada their way into that because that works for some in the neuro majority. The system, the entire system we have right now, it works okay for the neuro majority. But I think we all recognize it's not perfect. It could be better. And so we're trying to help people to do better and make these make their workplace more adaptive to these sort of needs and conditions. So the autistic and neurodivergent elements within their populations can thrive. And as a consequence of that, they get more productivity, better work. Like there's just a ton of benefits. The morale is improved. And oh, by the way, in virtually every environment that we've enacted some of these changes and stuff that benefit the neuro minority, the neurodivergent individuals, it ends up not just helping us. It turns out it helps everybody else. It turns out that a lot of the things that make it almost impossible for me to work in a workplace are just kind of bugging everybody else too. Not to the degree that they can't work, but it's still kind of bugging them. And you remove that irritant, you make something more accommodating and inclusive for somebody like me, everybody else tends to go, this is better. I like this better. So it doesn't, these sorts of changes to make a workplace more inclusive and diverse doesn't just help the minorities and people like me. It ends up like lifting all the boats. And that excites me because that is a lot more scalable. It's a little bit easier to get some buy-in. But one thing we're absolutely clear on in our aim of changing the workplaces, this is not charity. We're not talking about, oh, please give these people a hand up because they need help. No, these are highly capable people. They get a lot of quality. It's not an accident that, when I was working at Forward Credit, I very quickly rose up to a loss prevention status. And then I was there as one of the highest performing employees in North, Central, and South America. That's not despite my autism. In some parts, it was because of my autism. And I was, to a lesser degree, getting the accommodations I needed to thrive and be successful because I was fortunate that I had a boss who recognized, oh, this kid's got a lot of potential. I could get a lot of high quality work out of this kid. Let me put forth a little extra effort to kind of work with him to accommodate some of his eccentric needs and stuff. And we got along great. And I got a lot of high quality work. We see elements of that throughout our society. Out of the 80% unemployed, underemployed, that means that there's another 20% that is actually doing it quite well. And some of those folks are some of the best in their field. So we're talking about a population, a segment of our population that is potentially very highly capable and effective at our jobs.
Then what role does technology play in the Frist Center's efforts to support and integrate neurodiverse individuals in the workplace? Any success stories or case studies that had a significant impact?
Yeah, it's, we think about this problem from the perspective of the pipeline to employment. You can think of all the steps, school is a part of that steps, college might be a part of that step, work study programs, internships, this pipeline that takes an individual and ends up, and the idea is at the end of that pipeline, they have a job that could potentially turn into a career. Certainly they're making enough of a living to live, as an independent, fully functional adult. That pipeline to employment, we look at that pipeline and we're basically looking at all the little kinks in it at where is this pipeline failing neurodivergent people. So we identify those segments and then we look at those. And sometimes through our research and stuff, we find that the best solution is maybe we need to do some training for like the HR job interviewer so they can do a more effective HR interview that won't unintentionally filter out autistic people who may not be the best at making eye contact or having conversations, but might have the skill set to run circles around the other person who ends up getting hired that's really affable and fun to talk to and a great conversation, but might not be a fraction as good of as a coder or a programmer as the awkward one that you passed by. So there's some steps like that. Some of the training is for training up the individuals themselves on soft skills, making some changes to the workplace, and anything that can impact employment, we consider a part of our wheelhouse. So one of the most effective uses we've had of technology that I can think today is our deputy director, Nilanjan Sakar. His team pioneered and created a driving simulator that's built to teach autistic learners how to drive. Because if you take our population as a whole, the percentage of us who are capable of getting driver's licenses versus the percentage of us who actually have driver's licenses is shockingly small. Most of us who are capable of driving end up not learning how to drive. And the problem with that is that fundamentally the way we need to be taught how to drive differs so much from most people. We're detail-oriented people. We have anxiety, all kinds of anxieties and stuff about things. Like we need a really detailed step-by-step sort of patient teaching method. We need to be given a level of detail in some of the instructions and stuff that most people can't, quite frankly, like want to follow or can't even conceive of if they're trying to teach us. So if you try to teach us like a normal person, where you just throw us behind the wheel and yada yada some instructions and then have us practice and stuff, like we're going to freak out. I had a hard time learning how to drive. I was very fortunate that I lived out in the woods, out on a farm in rural Tennessee. So I had a lot of dirt roads. I had I could go days without ever seeing other traffic, and I could often have the road to myself, and so I had plenty of places where I could make lots of mistakes and stuff until I kind of figured it out. But when I did eventually learn how to drive, I was very salty at how I was taught because I felt it was wrong. I had a whole laundry list of things I thought that should have been done. When I became a parent myself, each of my 3 now young adult children are on the autism spectrum. I taught all of them the way I wish that I had been taught to drive, which was very slow, and some people would find it as almost sort of a pedantic, painful way of teaching them. Well, Nilanjan Sakar and his group understood through the research and the literature that this was an unmet need. And so they built a driving simulator that measures things like with eye trackers and stuff like that, because some of the details we need to be taught is like not just go the speed limit, obey the traffic laws, but how much time should your gaze be fixated on the road ahead? How often should you check your side view or rear view mirrors? How often should you check your speedometer? How long should your gaze linger when you're checking those things? It sounds like an overly detailed sort of thing, but these are the sorts of things, especially when we're first learning a skill, that are needed for us. So they built a driving simulator that allows them to practice driving, and it's also measuring like their eye gaze and stuff like that, and it's giving them feedback. And so it teaches them sort of best practices and helps them learn some of these micro skills that are necessary for the larger skill set of just being a good and effective driver. And I'm really excited about that technology in particular because that research has been going on for a really long time, and we're actually on the cusp of getting it to a commercialization stage where that technology can start being shared throughout the world, be taken out of the research lab and actually put in the hands of people who could do something. So that for me is one of the biggest bits when I'm thinking of technology. And they've done some similar things with VR, with an interview simulator that's meant to be used as a tool for a job coach that also has biometric feedbacks, so we can measure, so a coach could go back through the interview with the person afterwards and say, I noticed on question 3, your anxiety levels really spiked. Let's talk about what was it about question 3 that made you so upset, or what is it that made you so anxious, and talk them through that and help them to prepare so when they go to a real life interview, if they get asked a similar question, hopefully they don't choke or kind of freak out, but they're kind of like, oh, I've practiced this before. I know about this, and kind of work their way through that. They're even looking at doing a social simulator with AI, where you could build a VR environment like a workplace, like hanging around the cooler and having a conversation about a show or something like that. Sounds like a silly and trivial sort of thing, but those of us on the autism spectrum, to one degree or another, have a social disability. We have difficulty initiating conversations with people or going with the proper flow of a social conversation that's so important for people to be able to form bonds and get to know each other and stuff. Like, we can have trouble with some of those things. So an interview, not an interview, but a social simulator where we could try those things out and learn some of those rules of the culture and stuff can be a godsend for us. Those of us who are able to socialize professionally and like academically, like I'm able to do that. I didn't figure all that out myself. I was very, very fortunate that I had some kind-hearted souls during my development that were willing and able to sit down with me and answer my questions in a way other than most people. When I'd ask a question, they would say that's obvious or everybody knows the answer to that. And then they would be unable or unwilling to articulate the details. So it was a very frustrating sort of thing. I knew there were rules going on. I knew everybody there was a rhythm to this dance, but nobody would explain the rhythm to me. Occasionally I would find somebody who says, hey, you know, that thing you said just now, the way you said it, you can't say it that way. Like, that's just unprofessional, or that's hurtful. You know, and I would get some feedback and stuff about what I could and couldn't say. And with those people's help, I was able to learn slowly and painfully sort of the rules of the game. And of course, the fewer rules I broke, the better I was able to kind of get along with people, the more connections I was able to make with people. So there's a lot of potential good that can come about from sort of technologies like these. And we're a real big, I like to think of it this way. There's no silver bullet that's going to solve this problem, right? There's no program, there's no tool, there's no A that I'm just going to design and hand to autistic people and it solves all their problems and we sing Kumbaya and everything. There's a bunch of little issues, and some of them might affect me, but might not affect the next autistic person, you know. So we recognize there's no silver bullet, but we can identify these specific bits and bit by bit knock down these barriers or build these workarounds to these barriers. And hopefully over time, we can eventually design a system, a better pipeline to employment that will do a better job of serving people like me, but also I think it will also serve the neuromajority as well.
Would you like to highlight any ongoing projects or initiatives led by the Frist Center?
Well, I mean, we do so much in so many areas. It's kind of a difficult question to kind of answer, but let me try to hit you with some of the highlights that are representative. So in our early days, the first companies we started working with were companies like Specialist Sterna, companies that already had a proven track record of hiring and retaining neurodivergent talent. Specialist Sterna, over 75% of their employees are on the autism spectrum. Some of those folks, they have a guy there that's like in his 40s. He was in his 40s when he was hired. He had a master's degree, had never worked a full-time job. Then he got hired by them, trained by them. He's been working for them full-time like 10, 15 years now. You know, so in our early days, we would go to companies like that and say, what's your secret sauce? What are you doing different than everybody else? How is this guy able to get a job and thrive and be successful here when he was never able to do that anywhere else? And working with partners like that, we're able to suss out some of the best practices and stuff. These days, more and more, we're working with companies that want to be the next Specialist Sterna or want to be better with the neurodivergent segments of their workforce and stuff. And we pass on some of those best practices and some tips and tricks and some tools and resources to kind of help with that. So that's almost like the meat and potatoes of what the Frist Center does is, you know, step one is to find the best pipeline. And then step two is get that pipeline in the hands of the people who can actually make use of it and stuff. So I'm really proud of that work. That's a really exciting job, a really exciting aspect of the job, working with these companies, especially when I see them adopting better practices and stuff. And then I talk to the neurodivergent members within those companies and they find that it's now a better work environment. They're able to be more effective at what they do, or they feel like their needs are better met and stuff. That is such a wholesome and fun thing to be involved with. And so every summer I run an autism summer internship program, which is we fly in autistic neurodivergent students from all over the country. We house them, we pay them a stipend to compensate them for their time, and they spend 10 weeks over the summer working either in a research lab that's doing autism work or a lab that's commensurate with the major that they're working on. So if it's a chemistry major, we'll embed them in a chemistry lab or something like that. It's just like a research experience for undergrads. REU program is an NSF-funded program that does something very similar, except ours is aimed specifically at neurodivergent folks. And while they're getting that internship experience, we're also helping them with professional development and helping to teach them some of the soft skills that, again, normal people seem to be able to yada yada their way through, but we need a little bit of hand-holding, a little bit of heads up, a little bit of explicit instruction to wrap our heads around what's a good strategy for working through this stuff. But I would like to think that first and foremost, what the Frist Center is more than anything else is we are sort of a nexus point for this sort of stuff. Anything that could impact employment, anything that could impact neurodivergent person's success in employment, we consider it to be a part of our wheelhouse. And so the dirty little secret of how we seem to be able to do so much and be so successful is we're not doing all this ourselves. This is if we find somebody who's working on something that we look at and go, oh, this could have an impact on our mission, and we start to collaborate with them and work with them, do a little research, check to see how it works. And then when we go, yes, this is solving part of the problem on that, then we want to amplify their message. We want to include them in the pipeline. We're sharing the resources with other people. So if you go through our website and you look at a lot of the resources and stuff, you'll see accreditation of who actually created it and where it actually came from.
Speaking of how the Frist Center started with talking to companies who are doing very well in being inclusive, what advice would you give to companies looking to create a more inclusive environment for neurodiverse workers?
Yeah, well, I would say first and foremost, please recognize that one size fits all is a terrible strategy, not just for neurodivergent people, but even for your neuromajority workplaces. You need to start finding ways to be more flexible and adaptable with your employees whenever possible. That's the first most important thing. A second thing is that if you're talking to someone who's neurodivergent, that means some aspects of their minds work differently than other people. Like, I think about problems differently than most people. I have a very different perspective. We can be standing shoulder to shoulder looking at the same set of circumstances or the same data set, and I might have a very different perspective than the one that you have. The way I think is much more literally speaking. For me, the definitions of words are very, very important. Not because I just decided that one day, but this is how I'm wired, right? I'm a very literal sort of thinker. So I always say exactly what I mean, which can come across as very blunt and direct. So a company working with me, they have to kind of understand that I might come across as blunt and direct, but that's not me trying to be a jerk or all the normal assumptions we make about normal people when they start getting very blunt and direct and with their language. For a normal person, that maybe they're upset or they're on the verge of starting a fight or something, or they're trying to hurt the other person. We're not like that at all. Like, we're very blunt and direct because we don't know how else to say it. And on the flip side, when you're talking to someone whose brain might be working a little differently than yours, it's very important to be careful with what you say and how you say it. And usually the best thing you can go is try to be as blunt and direct as possible. Try to be as unambiguous as possible. If someone asks a bunch of niggling little questions, but what about this and what about that and stuff, and they're trying to get the details of the specifics. If the details don't matter to you so much, that probably feels annoying to go like, oh, you don't need that level of detail. Well, you don't need that level of detail, but that person may need that level of detail. So trying to meet people where they're at, trying to give an honest effort to answer their questions to the best of your ability, and trying to be patient with that sort of thing can mean a world of difference for interacting with an autistic or neurodivergent person like myself. So that's the big thing I would stress with companies is, look, even if I could wave a magic wand and have every worker in the United States wake up tomorrow and just understand, hey, not everybody's brain works the same way mine does. Not everybody sees things the same way I do. Not everybody is easy at the same things that's easy for me, or hard at the same things that's hard for me. What's easy for me could be hard for someone else, and vice versa. And when I see someone who's clearly demonstrating that their brain doesn't quite work the same way as, I shouldn't look down at them, or I shouldn't think that one perspective is better or worse. I should just recognize that it's different. And difference is okay. Difference is actually a competitive advantage. And I think some companies understand that. My hypothetical is, imagine you have two groups of people. One group of people, everybody is the same. They all came from the same culture. They all have the same background. They all speak the same language with the same accent. They all think about things the same way. Well, in terms of like unit cohesion and kumbaya, that's a great thing because everybody's sort of like in sync and together. So in that regards, it's a good thing because they're all like a family almost, right? The downside is that if you hit them with a problem or an issue, you got 30 people there, you might have 30 copies of the same solution because they're all thinking about it the same way. They all look at it the same way. Well, that solution may or may not work. And what if it doesn't work? You're kind of stuck because they can't really think of something else because they're all like have the same perspective, which means they might all share the same blind sides. Now, if you have another team that has some more neurodiversity amongst it, I mean, some of the people are going to be thinking just like the group on Team A, but some of them are going to have a very different perspective. Some of those perspectives might be not very helpful in the moment, but some of them might be brilliant and insightful. They may not have a blind side that everybody else has and instantly see to the heart of the solution and go, hey, have you guys thought about it this way? This is what I suggest we do to solve this. And everybody else might be, oh my God, that's brilliant. I never would have thought of it. So we're all better off if we're a part of a group, especially if we're wanting to solve problems. And at its core, any sort of like thinking job, that's what it comes down to, is coming up with solutions or trying to figure things out. You want diversity of thought in that team. It maximizes your probability of success. It maximizes your ability to discover things that you might have otherwise missed. And so whether people realize it or not, it's well worth the labor of adopting a philosophy or a worldview or a way of interacting with others that is more accommodating and accepting of the fact that we don't all think alike and we don't all see things the same way. I give neuromajority people a bit of a pass because for them, they're mostly right. Most people do generally experience the world the way they do and see things the way they do. I mean, there's differences, but there's not the sorts of differences between them and me. And so they probably just never really noticed somebody like me, or when they did see evidence that someone's brain works differently than theirs, they just made assumptions and then just dismissed that person. We've got to stop doing that. We have to start, first and foremost, just recognizing one another's existence and recognizing that there's value in figuring out a way to work together. That's the biggest hurdle right there.
You have multiple children on the spectrum. So being a parent of autistic children, how has your personal experiences shaped your approach or changed your approach to your work?
Yeah, it's part of the reason why I'm an advocate and part of the reason why I said yes to this job and part of the reason why I do what I do, a big part is that I want to help people. I want to be a positive influence in the world. That's a very human sort of thing. So I'm motivated in part because I want to help people. That's a big part of why I do what I do. And I'm thinking about how to help these individuals. Part of the work is helping companies to have a better understanding of us and be willing to give us the accommodations and supports we need. But part of it is working with neurodivergent individuals themselves. And so, yeah, with each of my 3 kids, I was very mindful and intentional of trying to give them the tools to thrive and be successful, to give them the teaching to kind of work with that. So I absolutely, there was a part of my brain that was worried about where they were going and whether they would be hot, and then it derailed me. That's a bit of my ADHD right there. So bear with me. So first and foremost, like I wanted to help people, and not just the companies and the corporations and stuff, but I also want to help the individuals themselves. And part of what can help us thrive and be successful is we need to learn some of those professional development skills. We need to learn how to advocate for ourselves in a way that's likely to lead to positive outcomes and stuff. And so as I was raising my three kids, I was trying to teach each and every one of them how to advocate for themselves, make sure they get the accommodations and supports, try to arm them with the tools to help ensure that their journey into adulthood is not as painful and traumatic as mine was. Unfortunately, with neurodivergent people, there's almost always some trauma because so much of the world doesn't understand us. And in the times when we need support or help, we instead get like unfairly judged. And often we get the opposite of what we need to thrive and be successful. So, I was very mindful of this. I still am when I'm talking to my kids and I'm trying to help them with something. That absolutely shapes my approach to the work. And my work with autistic individuals at the Frist Center, I'm constantly learning about better methods, better approaches, better styles, maybe a particular way to explain something, or some teaching aids or some materials and stuff out there that might be useful. I'm using that information in my personal life when I'm working with my kids, and with my kids in my journey of like working and helping with them. That's helping me to discover like better methods when I'm working with other people's. So it's like pretty much, my kids, I have the most experience of working with of anybody, right? Obviously, I've worked with them much more than anybody else, but any neurodivergent person that I'm interacting with, I'm trying to figure them out. I'm trying to figure out how to help them. And I'm also assessing how effective am I being at helping them, what works and what doesn't. And then I'm taking those lessons for the next person I talk to, and the next person, and the next person. So it's all just sort of like tied in together as an aspect of my job at the Frist Center.
Awesome. Do you have any advice for the parents, siblings, or friends of autistic or neurodiverse people?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I have these kinds of conversations a few times a week where I have parents reaching out. I also volunteer over at Autism Tennessee, and so I work with a number of people, including parents. And one of the first things I tell someone, especially when they're new to this and they just found out that their kid's autistic, and they're panicking and freaking out, and they still haven't quite like grasped that or learned with that. The biggest thing I kind of stress to them is that in some ways your child's mind works differently than yours. That's not a bad thing. But one of the most important things for you to realize is that the perfect childhood for you, all of the things that mattered in the certain order that it mattered, that you think are so wholesome for you and that all kids must have, you got to be open-minded about that. Maybe that doesn't work for them. If you find like being joined onto a baseball team and being around lots of people and stuff was like really important for your development, and that led to a lot of joy and stuff, and then you're trying to make your kid do that, and your kid doesn't want to do that, or your kid is very resistant to that, I've seen some parents like will be sad. Well, my child doesn't get to play on the baseball team like I did, therefore their life is inferior to mine. Their experience is so much inferior than mine. They've set the expectations of what's important to what's important to them. You got to recognize that, and recognize that that's wrong. You can't force your child to relive the same childhood you have with the expectation that they're going to get the same experiences out of it. One of the most common things I hear from autistic parents, particularly for autistic boys, is that their kid spends too much time indoor. If they are socializing at all, it's only like on games or on the internet where they're chatting with friends and they're playing something online. And I've actually heard parents lament, "Oh, my child just doesn't have the kind of social life that I had when I was growing up," and they don't have any friends. In fact, when I hear them say they don't have any friends, the first question I ask them is, "Well, do they play any games online?" And it's almost always like, "Yes." "And are there people that they play with online?" "Yes." "Do they regularly hang out with the same people and talk to them all the time?" "Yes." They do have friends. They do have friends. And they go, "Well, but they're online. They're not real." I'm like, well, maybe not real for you. But for us, it's very, very much real. I have some friends that I've had for many, many, many years that I almost never see in person. The only time we're interacting is in the evenings when we log on to Discord or something, and then we're playing a game together, and we're exploring virtual environments, and we're having fun together. Those friends mean the world to me. I challenge anyone who is bold enough to claim that they have a friendship more meaningful than my friendship with mine. Autistic people are all about quality, not quantity. We may not have as many friends as other people, but when we do, those friends mean the world to me. They mean the world to us and stuff. So your child may actually be getting all that they need out of socializing, even if it's just a virtual interaction. It can be real and impactful and meaningful for them. And you need to recognize that and be a little bit more flexible about that. Now, if your child is lamenting about how they're lonely and they don't feel like they're making enough connections and stuff, and then you want to come to me and say they don't have enough friends, I absolutely agree with you. Obviously, that's not enough, but stop making that assumption. Get some feedback from your kids. And if they're doing something that you feel is weird or different or makes you feel uncomfortable, and you're going to try to make them stop, one of the biggest harms we see from autistic kids is parents who try to force them to walk and talk and act like a normal person. And I know that comes from a good place. I know that comes from love. I know that comes from, I want my child to thrive and be successful. But it can do real harm, and it can do more harm than good. And there are a lot of autistic adults who refuse to interact with their parents because they're so salty about how terrible of a job and how traumatizing the job it was when that parent was trying to do just the best. A perfect example of that is stimming. So all human beings stim. I like to say autistic traits are really human traits, but taken to an extreme. Everybody at some point or another in their life, when they're nervous or anxious, has like fidgeted with a pen or tapped a foot or something like that. There's something about our body that like little like repetitive motions or something is sort of like helps us bleed off sort of like excess stress or excess anxiety, and nobody thinks about it. People get uncomfortable or feel awkward around an autistic person if we start flapping our arms or we start rocking to an exaggerated degree. Like we're stimming as well, but the impulse we feel might be 100 or 1,000 times stronger than it is for most people. And so it looks awkward or uncomfortable. And so you have parents who go like, don't fidget or don't flap your arms or something. And I'm like, hey, you shouldn't be telling them that. Like, are they hurting someone? Are they hurting themselves? Are they banging their head in the wall? Are they slapping people with their arms? Then yeah, absolutely, you get in there and you say, you can't do this. But you should also follow it up with, let's find a safe way for you to bleed out this nervous energy. Allow them to stim. If it's not hurting anybody, if the only thing it's doing is making you feel uncomfortable, that they look weird, then you need to swallow it. You need to become okay with it, because that kid is doing in their own way the best way they can to sort of deal with their own internal noise or their own internal trauma. And so stemming is one of those things. And that's changing. Like 20, 30 years ago, there's a ton of horror stories about kids in ABA therapy who is forced to do these. For us, it's to walk and talk and act in a normal way is very difficult for us. And it's labor intensive, and it doesn't make it a lot of sense. I like to describe it at like, I was born in a world where everybody walks around with ridiculous frumpy hats at a 32-degree angle, and they expect me to put on a ridiculous frumpy hat at a 32-degree angle. And sometimes the hat gets to a 31-degree angle, and everybody yells at me like I'm a monster because I'm not wearing the hat. Like, so much of it, without the context of being born with the same wiring that those people do, doesn't make sense to me. So I'm like, can we cut out all this nonsense? And can we just zoom down to the stuff that matters? Now, walking up to someone and screaming obscenities at them or saying something that's harmful or abusive, like that stuff I can get behind. Like, we shouldn't do that. But there's a reason for that. So there is a subset of things that we just shouldn't do to be decent to one another as human beings, to all live in the same sort of place and be able to get along with each other. But there's a much wider things of where people say, oh, this makes us uncomfortable. Well, it's time that you get comfortable with it. Like, you expect us to wear the frumpy hats, and we try to do that to accommodate you. But why don't we, instead of saying that one side has to do all the labor to meet the other, why don't we all kind of work to meet somewhere in the middle? Like, I should learn to be able to interact with people in such a way that I'm not carelessly saying things that hurt their feelings or upset them or traumatize them. I should absolutely be learning those sorts of rules. And you guys should be learning that that's not easy for me, that I'm not wired that way. I've never said anything to another human being that I would ever be upset or offended if somebody said it to me. The worst advice anybody ever gave me is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's awful, horrible advice for somebody like me, because I want to be blunt and direct and just say what's on my mind. And when people come up to me and they're blunt and direct and say what's on their mind, whether I like what they have to say or not, it doesn't upset me that they're saying. if I'm doing something wrong and you see that I'm doing something wrong and you come up to me and say, hey, the way you're doing that is wrong, there's a better way to do it, and then you explain that better way, I'm like, thank you for that. That's awesome. That's grateful. I was hoping I could find a better way. And so I see somebody doing something that I can think of a better way. I was really confused when I went up and started explaining to them how they could do it right. They get upset. That didn't make sense to me. It didn't make sense to me that people, the fact that people can be devastated and destroyed simply by hearing the utter facts was a very alien sort of concept that took me many, many years to sort of grapple. So yeah, we need to learn how to be able to function in society and minimize the harms that we do to other people. But the rest of society needs to learn that this is who we really are, and this is how our brains work. And we have legitimate social differences, social disabilities. And so we need to be given a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more patient, and people need to put forth a little labor to try to talk to us in a way that's easier for us to follow and understand. Yeah. Anybody who has any questions about related to neurodivergence and related to employment, and that's a pretty wide web, like emotional regulation is not necessarily something that's needed for a job directly, but if you have very poor emotional regulation, that can lead to emotional outbursts, which could get you fired or prevent you from being able to get a job in the first place. So we consider that like under our wheelhouse. If you need to learn how to drive, like the driving simulator, we're not trying to make Uber drivers and taxi drivers that are autistic. We're not trying to populate that market with autistic drivers specifically, but we recognize if you live in a place like Nashville and you don't have your own transportation, it's hard to maintain a full-time job. Everything is just kind of too far away. The bus schedules don't work really well. And so anything that could have an impact on employment, if you're neurodivergent or suspect you're neurodivergent and you're having struggles with anything related to employment, you can think of the Frist Center as a resource. If you're an employer or a manager or someone in the workplace that might have some autistic neurodivergent colleagues and you're wanting to help or you're wanting to better understand them, Frist Center is a good place for a resource. So we're very open and engaged with the public. I can and do sit down with individuals from the public all the time and have conversations, point them towards resources and stuff. We're always happy to help. That's how we accomplish our mission, is get the best practices and these resources in the hands of people that need them. And so we're always happy to try to help in whatever way we can. So I want your audience to think of the Frist Center as a nexus point, as a resource that they should feel empowered to engage and empower to access. That's the biggest bit I want to share with people. And I want to share a bit of hopeful news. Ever since I started this job, I've said this every year, and it's been true every year. Never better in the United States to be an autistic adult than today, and next year is going to be better than today. And that's an exciting thing to be a part of. Things are getting better. And it's a delight and a privilege to be involved with that process.
Dr. Caudel, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, and congratulations on the amazing success. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Anytime. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.